I don't believe men were created to be pawns in someone else's game. I believe we were created to be steward kings. Men under authority, yes, but entrusted with real responsibility. Not perfect men, but disciplined ones. Men who rule themselves, serve God directly, and refuse to live in fear. This is king, not pawn. Obedience is one of the most celebrated words in Christianity today, and for good reason. Scripture is clear. Obedience does matter. But here's what almost no one says out loud. There is a kind of obedience that does not produce strength, does not produce maturity, and it sure as heck does not produce sons. It produces dependence. Men who comply but don't really understand, men who follow but cannot lead when necessary, and men who obey instructions but freeze when the instructions and the rules are gone. And the church often mistakes this for faithfulness, and it's very wrong and stuff. Like, at least in my personal opinion, this is a pattern I actually started noticing a couple years ago, not from a stage, but in just these conversations I would have. Men would come to me with these questions, but they almost like weren't real questions. They weren't necessarily asking like, hey, what is right? They were asking, what is it that I'm allowed to do? Different words, different postures. And the strange thing was this: they were men who wanted to obey God. They weren't rebellious, they weren't lazy, they were cautious and maybe overly cautious, like men who had learned that thinking for themselves was dangerous or something like that. You know, I want to make this clear distinction. Obedience is not the same as understanding. Here's the distinction we have to make. Obedience answers the question, what am I supposed to do? Understanding the question is, well, why does this matter? A slave is trained to obey commands. A son is trained to understand the mission. And when you remove understanding from obedience, you don't get holiness, you get fragility. So look, this took place, about 2 years ago. There was a man I watched in my life, and he essentially was like just frozen over a decision that he really already did know the answer to. It was a job opportunity. Clear improvement, more responsibility, but whatever it was, like he wouldn't move. Not because the option was sinful, not because it violated scripture in any way, but because no one had explicitly told him that it was God's will. He kept waiting for confirmation, another sign, another voice. Eventually, the opportunity just disappeared. And what struck me wasn't his disappointment. Really, it was his confusion. He had been obedient his whole life, but he had never been trained to discern. And that's why, like, this fear-based obedience, it feels safe even though it isn't. Obedience without understanding feels safe simply just because it removes responsibility. If you're just following instructions, you're never accountable for the outcome, right? You did what you were told. But that posture comes at a cost. A man who simply never learns. That kind of man will always panic when conditions change, and conditions, as we know, are always changing. Scripture, in fact, it doesn't actually praise blind obedience contrary to popular belief. This is where a lot of people get uncomfortable, because it actually praises wise obedience. Be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves, Matthew 10:16. Wisdom implies perception, discernment, judgment. You cannot be wise if you're never allowed to think for yourself. And that's why systems prefer men who just don't understand. So let's go ahead and zoom out for a second. Why is obedience without understanding so common these days? It's because it makes people easy to manage. A man who doesn't understand doesn't challenge assumptions. He doesn't question motives. He doesn't adapt well. He doesn't initiate. They just wait. And waiting men are the most convenient thing to these systems of power, above us. But convenience is not the goal of the kingdom, right? So look, I remember another moment, okay, where a man asked a sincere question in a group setting. We were just kind of in a big group. It wasn't confrontational. No one was going at each other. It wasn't disrespectful in any way. It was just clear. And once he asked the question, the room went quiet. Instead of engaging the question, the response was actually just mainly a warning. Be careful. Don't overthink. Just trust leadership. That moment taught everyone watching something really important. That clarity was risky and understanding was optional. Silence was safer. No one said it explicitly because they didn't have to. Crazy, right? So look, sons are trained, slaves are managed. Let's look at how God deals with men in the scripture. Abraham negotiates. Moses actually argues with God. David reasons with God. The disciples constantly ask Jesus questions. And guess what? God corrects them. He does not silence them. Why? Because sons must learn judgment. A man who cannot reason cannot rule. Most men today, they confuse submission with surrender of the mind. And look, submission is biblical, absolutely. But submission is not the surrender of discernment. Submitting your will to God does not mean abandoning your mind. In fact, actually says the opposite. Love the Lord with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. Matthew 22:37. Mind is not optional. Obedience without understanding breaks under pressure. And here's the test. When life presents you a situation that you've never seen before, there's no rule, there's no precedent, no authority figure to consult, what is it that you actually do? Take a second to think about that. Because here's something that I've noticed. Men trained only to obey, they freeze. Men trained to understand, adapt. That difference decides who leads, who hesitates, who collapses. Okay? Look, something else I want to kind of share was this moment that kind of got me thinking. Just, that moment that you're never really quite prepared for, right? There's a moment that every man faces when there's no one there to tell him what to do. No pastor, no mentor, no playbook, just consequences. In that moment, your theology becomes real. Not what you've memorized or anything like that, but what you understand. And I think, honestly, that's probably why Jesus explained more than he commanded. You notice something about Christ in the Bible, he gave commands, but he also explained relentlessly. Parables, questions, corrections. He didn't just say, hey, just trust me. He said, do you understand this? And when they didn't, he taught them again. Because he wasn't forming servants, he was forming rulers. Okay? Understanding at the end of the day produces initiative. A man who understands God's character doesn't need constant permission. He can act without panic. He can course correct without collapsing in the process because he knows the mission at hand. And men who know the mission don't wait for instructions at every step. So look, there is a big risk here of becoming a pawn. Here's the danger. When a man is trained only to obey, he borrows conviction. He outsources responsibility, he avoids ownership, and he becomes movable. A pawn on a chessboard. Useful, but never really with the board. Here's a shift that has to happen. Okay, the shift is this. From, I just want to do what I'm told, to, I want to understand what God is building. From, tell me the rules, to, train me in wisdom. That shift marks the transition from, compliance to actual stewardship. What God actually expects of his sons. God expects his sons to grow in discernment, accept correction, carry responsibility, and faithfully without constant supervision. Okay? Brings us back. Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little, I will set you over much. Matthew 25:21. Faithfulness is proven. Okay, this is where trust is required. So, Obedience matters, but obedience without understanding produces men who cannot stand on their own. God is not forming fragile followers. Okay? He is forming capable sons, men who can think, men who can discern, men who can act without fear. This is king, not pawn. Do not settle for borrowed conviction. Seek understanding.